On a Tuesday morning in late October of 2014, a man named Gerald Cutter stood at the edge of his north field and watched a black SUV idle at the end of his gravel drive for the third time that week. He didn't walk out to meet it. He didn't wave. He just stood there with his coffee going cold in his hand and watched it sit. And after a while it turned around and drove back toward town the way it always did, leaving a thin ribbon of dust hanging over the road like a question he hadn't answered yet. The offer on the table was $2,150,000, cash, for 340 acres of black Iowa topsoil that his grandfather had broken with a horse-drawn plow in 1931, that his father had mortgaged twice and paid back twice, and that Gerald had farmed alone since 1987, when his father's heart gave out between the corn rows in August, and the ambulance took 40 minutes to arrive because the county had cut the rural response budget that year. The developer's name was Preston Holloway. He was 38 years old, drove a leased Escalade, and had made his first million before he was 30 by flipping commercial properties in Des Moines. He wore pressed khakis to farm visits, and had never once, in Gerald Cutter's estimation, looked at a piece of land and seen anything other than what you could build on top of it. Preston Holloway had been buying up parcels along County Road F42 for 2 years. He had a vision. That was the word he used, vision, for a mixed-use development he called Prairie View Commons. Retail on the south end, residential on the north, a man-made pond in the middle with a fountain that would run April through October. He had renderings, he had investors. He had a county supervisor on his side and a zone invariance already approved for the parcels he'd managed to acquire. What he didn't have was the Cutter farm, which sat dead in the center of his planned development like a knot in a board, and which Gerald Cutter had no intention of selling at any price Preston Holloway was prepared to offer. Let me tell you about Gerald Cutter, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did and what it cost him and what it eventually meant. Gerald was 61 years old in the fall of 2014. He stood 6 feet and a quarter inch in his work boots and weighed 190 pounds, which was exactly what he had weighed at 25. He had a face the color of old saddle leather and hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same walnut as the handle of the cultivator his grandfather had used on this same ground. He had been married once, to a woman named Diane, who had left in 1999, not because she didn't love him, but because she loved him enough to know that the farm would always come first and she deserved to be someone's first. They remained friends. She sent a card every Christmas. He kept them in a shoebox on the kitchen counter. Gerald had 340 acres. He farmed 280 of them in corn and soybeans on a rotation, and left the remaining 60 in a mix of native prairie grass, 2 woodlots, a creek bottom that flooded every spring and dried back to nothing every August, and a 4-acre wetland that the county had tried to drain in 1978 and that Gerald's father had gone to court to protect and won. The farm sat at the highest elevation point in the township, which meant Gerald could stand at his north field on a clear morning and see 11 miles in 3 directions. He had stood in that same spot every morning of his adult life when he was home, which was most mornings because Gerald Cutter did not take vacations and had not left Iowa in 14 years. He was not a man who complained. He was not a man who explained himself. He went to the Lutheran church on the first Sunday of every month and sat in the 3rd pew from the back and left before the coffee hour. He bought his supplies at the co-op in Ames, his parts at the Case 1H dealer in Nevada, and his groceries at the same store in Colo that his mother had shopped at when he was a boy. He knew every neighbor within 5 miles by name, by the sound of their equipment, and by the particular way their fields looked in different lights and different seasons. He was, in the estimation of everyone who knew him, the most deeply rooted person in the county. Preston Holloway did not understand this. Preston Holloway believed that every man had a number, and that the job of a successful developer was simply to find it. He had started at one point $4 million and worked up in 6 months to $2.15 million, which was, by his own calculation, nearly double the appraised agricultural value of the land. He had sent letters, he had sent his assistant, he had sent his attorney. He had come himself, twice, and sat at Gerald's kitchen table drinking coffee he didn't want, and making arguments Gerald had heard before. Gerald had listened to every one of them with the same expression he wore when he was watching weather come in from the northwest. Attentive, patient, unmoved. The second time Preston came to the kitchen table, he brought a rendering of Prairie View Commons. He unrolled it on the table between the coffee cups and explained what would be built on what was currently Gerald's north field, his woodlot, his creek bottom, and his wetland. Gerald looked at the rendering for a long time without saying anything. Then he rolled it back up, handed it to Preston, and said, "I think you should go." Preston went, but he kept sending the SUV. Let me tell you about what Preston Holloway did not know about that farm, because it matters more than the price. The wetland in the southeast corner of the Cutter property was not just a wetland that Gerald's father had fought to protect. It was the primary recharge point for an aquifer that supplied drinking water to 6 farms and a rural water district serving 340 households across 3 townships. The county's own hydrological study conducted in 1994 and quietly filed and never publicly discussed had documented this in 32 pages of technical language that boiled down to a single conclusion. If that wetland was drained or paved, the aquifer would begin to decline within 5 years and would reach critical levels within 15. The county engineer who had written the report had retired in 2001. His successor had never read it. The 2 woodlots on the Cutter Farm's west side were the last stands of mature oak and hickory in the township. The larger of the 2 had trees that were 180 years old, which meant they had been saplings before Iowa was a state. Gerald knew every significant tree in both woodlots by species, approximate age, and the particular way the light came through them in the afternoon. He had never logged them and never intended to. They were not in his estate plan as timber. They were in his estate plan as a conservation easement that he had spent 3 years negotiating with a land trust in Ames and that he had signed in 2009. Which meant they could never be developed regardless of who owned the surrounding land. The north field, the 80 acres that Preston Holloway had designated for his residential section, had topsoil depth averaging 14 inches, which placed it in the top 3% of agricultural land in the county by productivity rating. Gerald had been building that topsoil for 30 years through a combination of cover cropping, no-till practices, and the application of compost from a small operation he ran behind his machine shed. He had soil tests going back to 1988 in a filing cabinet in his office, and the trend line on organic matter content was the most satisfying graph he had ever seen. That field was not an asset to be liquidated. It was a living system he had been building for 3 decades. Preston Holloway saw none of this. Preston Holloway saw acreage and location and a number on an appraisal report. The calls and the visits continued through 2014 and into 2015. Preston's patience, which was considerable for a man of his temperament, began to fray. He had investors who were asking questions. He had a county supervisor who had stuck his neck out on the zoning variance and was getting nervous. He had a construction timeline that was slipping. In the spring of 2015, he hired a local attorney to research whether there were any legal mechanisms, eminent domain, nuisance claims, anything, that could compel the sale. The attorney spent 2 weeks on it and came back with a single-page memo that said, in essence, no. Gerald Cutter owned his land free and clear, had no violations of any kind on record, maintained his property in exemplary condition, and had a conservation easement on the woodlots that would survive any ownership change. The only path forward was the one Preston already knew. Gerald had to say yes. Gerald never said yes. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever held something that everyone around you wanted to take, not because they were bad people, not because they meant you harm, but simply because they could not see what you saw when you looked at it? Have you ever stood on a piece of ground and known, in a way that went past words and past numbers, that it was not yours to sell? That is where Gerald Cutter stood every morning of his life, not in defiance, not in stubbornness, in clarity. Preston Holloway eventually built Prairie View Commons without the Cutter farm. He reconfigured his site plan, shifted the residential section north, reduced the pond from 4 acres to 1.5, and opened the development in the spring of 2017. The retail section filled quickly. The residential section sold moderately well through 2018. Preston declared it a success at a Chamber of Commerce dinner in November of that year and gave a speech about vision and persistence that people applauded. Gerald Cutter was not at the dinner. He was home, finishing the last of his fall field work. Let me tell you about what happened in the summer of 2019, because that is where this story stops being about one man's decision and starts being about something larger. It was the driest summer in the county since 1988. The rain stopped in late May and did not return in any meaningful way until September. The creek bottoms went dry. The ponds dropped. The rural water district that served 340 households began to see pressure drops in July, flow reductions in August, and by the first week of September was issuing a voluntary conservation notice that became a mandatory restriction by the 3rd week. The aquifer was declining, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but measurably and in the direction that the 1994 hydrological report had predicted it would go if the wetland recharge was ever compromised. The wetland on the Cutter farm had not been compromised. It was still there, still functioning, still doing what wetlands do in dry years, holding water in the ground, releasing it slowly, feeding the aquifer from below at a rate that no engineer had designed and no machine could replicate. Gerald's 4 acres of wet ground were, in the drought summer of 2019, the single most important piece of hydrology in the township. The county engineer, the new one who had not read the 1994 report, figured this out in August when he started mapping recharge zones, trying to understand why some parts of the aquifer were holding better than others. He drove out to the Cutter farm and walked the wetland with Gerald on a Thursday afternoon in late August, and Gerald showed him the springs that fed it and the tile outlets that his father had modified in 1961 to slow the drainage and deepen the water table, and the engineer stood there in the August heat looking at this 4-acre piece of ground and said quietly, "This is the whole thing, isn't it?" And Gerald said, "Yes. It always has been." The county supervisor who had backed Preston Holloway's zoning variance was a man named Dale Ferris. Dale Ferris had been in office for 11 years and was not a dishonest man, only an incurious one. the kind of official who approves what seems reasonable without asking what it costs. He had not read the 1994 hydrological report either. When the county engineer brought it to him in September of 2019, Dale Ferris read it twice and then sat with it on his desk for a week before he called the county attorney and asked what the county's exposure would be if it turned out they had approved development that compromised a primary aquifer recharge zone. The answer was not reassuring. Let me tell you about the meeting that happened in November of 2019, because Gerald Cutter told me it was the strangest afternoon of his life, and Gerald Cutter had lived through some strange afternoons. 3 county supervisors, the county engineer, the county attorney, and the director of the Rural Water District drove out to the Cutter farm on a Wednesday in November. Gerald met them in the yard. He had known they were coming. Dale Ferris had called ahead, but he had not changed out of his work clothes, which were the clothes he wore every day, and he had not cleaned up the yard, which was clean enough by any reasonable standard. They sat at his kitchen table, all 6 of them, with coffee Gerald made in the same 12-cup percolator he had used since 1994. And Dale Ferris explained the situation with the aquifer and the 1994 report, and what the county now understood about the role the Cutter wetland played in the regional water supply. Gerald listened to all of it without interrupting. When Dale Ferris finished, Gerald said, "I know." Dale Ferris looked at him. "How long have you known?" Gerald said, "Since 1994. My father knew before that. He went to court over it in 1978. There was a silence at the table that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. What the county wanted, it turned out, was not complicated. They wanted to formalize a conservation agreement on the wetland and the surrounding buffer, not the easement Gerald already had on the woodlots, but a separate agreement specifically protecting the wetland's hydrological function. They wanted to work with Gerald on a management plan. They wanted, in short, to catch up to a decision Gerald's father had made 40 years earlier, and that Gerald had been maintaining ever since, without any help or acknowledgement from anyone in that room. Gerald agreed to the conservation agreement. He did not ask for payment, though the county offered it. He asked instead for 3 things: that the county formally acknowledge in the agreement's preamble the role his father had played in protecting the wetland in 1978, that the county commit to reading and acting on its own technical reports within 5 years of their completion going forward, and that the Rural Water District install a monitoring station on the wetland's primary spring so that future county engineers would have data going back to the day of installation. The county agreed to all 3. The agreement was signed in January of 2020. Preston Holloway heard about the agreement through the Chamber of Commerce grapevine in February of that year. He drove out to the Cutter farm for the first time since 2015. He sat at the same kitchen table. Gerald made coffee in the same percolator. Preston was 44 now and had put on some weight and had the look of a man who had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to say it out loud. He said, "I didn't understand what I was asking you to sell." Gerald looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "No, you didn't." Preston said, "I'm not sure I understand it fully now." Gerald said, "Most people don't. That's why it needed protecting." Preston asked if he could walk the property. Gerald said yes and took him out himself, which was not something he did for many people. They walked the north field and the woodlots and the creek bottom and the wetland. Preston stood at the edge of the wetland for a long time without saying anything. He was wearing different shoes than he used to, work boots, not the pressed khaki shoes, and Gerald noticed this without commenting on it. At the edge of the wetland, Preston said, "If I had gotten this farm, all of this would be gone. Gerald said, yes, and 340 families would be hauling water by 2025. Preston didn't say anything to that. He just stood there looking at the water moving slowly through the cattails and the sedge. Let me tell you about what happened to the Cutter farm over the next 4 years, because the story does not end with the conservation agreement. The drought of 2019 had focused attention on agricultural water management across the county in a way that no amount of policy discussion had managed to do before. The County Extension Office, working with Iowa State, launched a watershed study in 2020 that used the Cutter wetland as its primary reference site, the benchmark against which they measured the degraded hydrology of surrounding areas. Graduate students came out in the spring and fall. Gerald walked every one of them through the property himself, explaining what his father had built and what he had maintained and why each piece of it worked the way it did. He was not a man who gave lectures, but he could answer questions all day, and the students had good questions. In 2021, the county created a new program, funded partly by state conservation dollars and partly by a settlement from a drainage district lawsuit that had nothing to do with the Cutter farm, to help neighboring landowners restore wetland function on their properties. Gerald served on the advisory committee. He was the only farmer on a committee that otherwise consisted of engineers, hydrologists, and agency staff, and he was, by the account of every person who served with him, the most useful person in the room. Not because he had credentials. He had a high school diploma and 40 years of observation, but because he had watched this particular landscape in every season and every weather condition for his entire adult life, and knew things about it that no study had captured and no model had predicted. By 2023, 7 neighboring farms had enrolled in the wetland restoration program. The aquifer levels, which had dropped measurably in 2019, had stabilized and were showing a slight recovery trend. The Rural Water District had not issued a conservation notice since 2019. The monitoring station on the Cutter Wetlands primary spring had been running for 3 years and had already generated a data set that the county engineer described as the most valuable hydrological record in the county. Let me tell you about what Dale Ferris said at the county supervisors meeting in March of 2023, because Gerald Cutter was in the room when he said it and told me it was the only time in his life he had ever been embarrassed by a compliment. Dale Ferris, who was in his last term and had spent the previous 4 years trying to make up for 40 years of incurious governance, stood up at the regular meeting and said that the county owed Gerald Cutter an accounting. He said that the Cutter farm had been providing services to the county's water supply for at least 40 years, services that the county had never acknowledged and never compensated, services that had become visible only when a drought made the invisible visible. He said that if the county had approved the Prairie View Commons development on the Cutter land, which it had been prepared to do, which it had wanted to do, which it had made every effort to facilitate, the county would now be facing a water infrastructure crisis of the first order. He said that Gerald Cutter had protected the county from itself, and that the county should say so plainly and on the record. The motion to formally acknowledge this passed 4-1. The one dissenting vote was from a supervisor who had been in office for 8 months and didn't fully understand what he was voting on. Gerald sat in the back row during this and looked at the floor during most of it. Afterward, in the parking lot, a woman from the extension office who had been attending the meeting said to him, "How does it feel to be vindicated?" Gerald thought about this for a moment and then said, "It feels about the same as it always did. The wetland doesn't know anyone said anything about it." He got in his truck and drove home. Let me tell you about the conversation Gerald had with his nephew Marcus in the spring of 2024, because Marcus is the reason this story continues past Gerald. Marcus Cutter was 34 years old and had grown up in Ames and worked for an environmental consulting firm in Des Moines. He had visited the farm as a child and sporadically as an adult and had understood it in the way that people who grow up near farms without growing up on them understand farms as a place that existed, that was important to someone, that had a general claim on his respect without a specific claim on his time. In the spring of 2024, he came out for a week to help Gerald with some fencing and stayed 3 weeks because something happened to him that he could not fully explain, which was that he walked the property every morning with his uncle and began to understand for the first time what he was looking at. Gerald was 71 now. He moved the same way he always had, deliberate, unhurried, economical. But Marcus noticed that he moved more carefully on uneven ground than he used to, and that he sometimes stopped and stood still for a moment in the middle of a field in a way that was not quite resting. Gerald did not talk about his health. He talked about the farm. He talked about what the North Field needed in the next 5 years, and what the woodlot's oldest oaks would look like in another 20, and what the monitoring data from the wetland spring suggested about the aquifer's long-term trajectory. He talked about these things the way a man talks about plans he intends to carry out himself, but Marcus heard underneath them the sound of a man explaining something to someone who would need to know it. On the last morning of Marcus's visit, they walked the wetland together at first light. The spring was running well. It had been a wet April, and the water was clear and cold and moved through the cattails with the sound like paper tearing slowly. Gerald stopped at the same spot where Preston Holloway had stood 5 years earlier and looked at the water for a long time. Then he said to Marcus, without turning around, "Your great-grandfather went to court for this in 1978. Your grandfather broke this ground in 1931. I've been here since 1987. That's almost 100 years of the same family making the same decision about the same piece of ground." He paused. "The decision isn't complicated, it's just not popular." Marcus stood there and didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, "I'd like to learn it, if you'll teach me." Gerald turned around and looked at him with an expression Marcus had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been offered help. He said, "I was hoping you'd say that." Marcus enrolled in a sustainable agriculture program at Iowa State that fall. He kept his consulting job part-time and drove out to the farm on weekends and most Wednesdays. Gerald taught him the soil testing protocol and the cover crop rotation and the tile drainage system his grandfather had modified in 1961, and the particular way the North Field drained after a heavy rain, and what that meant for planting timing. He taught him the names of the trees in the woodlots and the species of sedge and cattail in the wetland, and the way the spring behaved differently in wet years and dry years, and what those differences told you about the aquifer below. He taught him slowly and without impatience, the way a man teaches something he has been given rather than something he invented. In the fall of 2024, Preston Holloway's son, a young man named Cade who was 26 and worked in commercial real estate in Des Moines, drove out to the county on behalf of a development group that was putting together a logistics hub project along County Road F42. The project required water access, and the Rural Water District had referred them to the county engineer, who had referred them to the monitoring data from the Cutter wetland, which had referred them, eventually, to Gerald Cutter. Cade Holloway did not know whose farm he was visiting. He had his father's jawline and his father's pressed khakis and a rendering rolled up under his arm, and he pulled into the Cutter Farm Drive on a Tuesday afternoon in October and found Marcus in the yard repairing a section of fence. Marcus looked at the rendering under the young man's arm and then looked at his face and said, "You must be Preston Holloway's son." Cade looked surprised and said yes. Marcus said, "I've heard about your father. Come inside." They sat at the same kitchen table. Marcus made coffee in the same percolator. Gerald came in from the field a half-hour later with mud on his boots and sat down and listened to Cade Holloway explain what his development group needed and what they were proposing and what they were prepared to offer. Gerald listened to all of it without interrupting. When Cade finished, Gerald said, "Your father sat at this table 10 years ago with a rendering and an offer." Cade said, "I know. He told me about it." Gerald looked at him carefully. "What did he tell you?" Cade was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He told me that he didn't understand what he was asking someone to sell, and that I should make sure I understood that before I asked anyone for anything." Gerald looked at Cade Holloway for a long time. Then he looked at Marcus. Then he looked back at Cade and said, "Your father learned something. That's not nothing." He stood up and said, "Let's walk the property. Then we'll talk about what you actually need and whether there's a way to get it that doesn't cost something that can't be replaced." They walked for 2 hours. Cade Holloway asked good questions. He took notes in a small notebook rather than on his phone, which Gerald noticed without commenting on. At the edge of the wetland, Cade stopped and looked at the spring running clear and cold into the cattails and said, "My father stood here?" Marcus said, 5 years ago." Cade said, "He told me it was the most important piece of ground he'd ever stood on. I thought he was being dramatic." Gerald said, "He wasn't." The logistics hub project was eventually sited 2 miles north of the Cutter Farm, on ground that the county engineer confirmed had no hydrological sensitivity. The Rural Water District worked with the development group on a connection agreement that didn't require new infrastructure. The project broke ground in the spring of 2025. Cade Holloway sent Gerald a letter when it did, 2 paragraphs, handwritten, that said in part that he hoped the project honored the understanding his father had tried to pass on to him and that he was grateful for the afternoon. Gerald kept the letter in the shoebox on the kitchen counter with Diane's Christmas cards. Let me tell you one last thing, because it is the part of this story that Gerald himself would never tell you. Not because he is modest, though he is, but because he does not think of it as remarkable, which is the most remarkable thing about it. In the 37 years that Gerald Cutter farmed those 340 acres, he never once applied for a development permit. He never once entertained a subdivision. He never sold an easement for a cell tower or a pipeline or a wind turbine, though he was asked about all of them. He paid his property taxes every year on land that was assessed at agricultural value, which meant he was paying taxes on a fraction of what developers told him it was worth, which meant he was, in a real and measurable sense, subsidizing his own refusal to sell by accepting a lower return on the land's assessed value than he could have demanded. He did this not as a sacrifice, not as a statement, but as a simple extension of the same logic that governed everything else he did on the farm. You take care of what you've been given, you don't take more than you need, and you leave it better than you found it. The county has a name for what the Cutter Farm provides now. They call it Ecosystem Services, which is the language of policy documents and grant applications and technical reports. Gerald calls it farming. Marcus calls it farming. The graduate students who come out in the spring and fall have started calling it farmin' too, which is a sign that something is being understood that was not understood before. The wetland is still there. The spring still runs. The oldest oaks in the woodlot are 185 years old now, which means they have been growing on that ground longer than Iowa has been a state, longer than the Cutter family has been on the land, longer than anyone now living can remember. The monitoring station Gerald requested in 2020 is still recording. The data set it has generated is, in the county engineer's words, irreplaceable. The Northfield's organic matter content is still trending in the right direction, year by year, the way it has been since Gerald started measuring it in 1988. Marcus will farm it next. He knows the soil tests and the tile system and the names of the trees and the way the spring behaves in wet years and dry years. He knows what his great-grandfather broke with a horse-drawn plow in 1931 and what his grandfather protected in court in 1978 and what his uncle maintained alone for 37 years while the world outside the fence line changed in every direction. He knows the decision is not complicated. It's just not always popular. And somewhere in a Des Moines office, Preston Holloway, who is 50 now and has built a great many things on a great many pieces of ground, keeps a photograph on his desk that he took on his phone the afternoon Gerald walked him through the wetland in 2020. It is a photograph of the spring, running clear and cold through the cattails in the October light. His assistant asked him once what it was a picture of, and he said it was a picture of something he almost destroyed without knowing it. She asked him what it was called, and he said he wasn't sure it had a name exactly, that it was just the thing that was there before anything else, still doing what it had always done, still running the way it was built to run, the way it would keep running long after every building he had ever put up had been torn down, and the ground beneath them had forgotten they were there. That's what happens when a man spends his whole life protecting something that everyone else kept trying to turn into something